So a couple of things I want to talk about today. One is that Mike Pompeo has been talking about how the US intends to meddle in the UK government and prevent Jeremy Corbyn, the UK Labour leader, from becoming Prime Minister. And he said this in a speech. He said this in a gathering of Jewish leaders, and it was in relation to this trumped-up smear campaign that is that Jeremy Corbyn is supposedly anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel and its occupation of Palestinians and its apartheid situation for Palestinians. So, you know, there's continual smears about Jeremy Corbyn in the UK mainstream media, the garbage that they promote in relation to Jeremy Corbyn is astounding. So Jeremy Corbyn, I imagine that hopefully the Labour Party will be on the watch out for this meddling, but this is something that, you know, has been done in my country, in Australia, and it continues to be done. In fact, I think in 1975, the CIA admitted, later, in 1975, the CIA interfered with our government here and helped get Gough Whitlam, who was a democratic socialist prime minister who believed in free healthcare and free education and wasn't a big fan of war, etc. Well, they managed to help oust him, so he was dismissed. And they've continued meddling since then, of course, because that's what the United States government does. That's what Washington does. They meddle in so many countries' affairs and constantly overthrowing democratically elected governments. And I'll show you that little meme, if I can find it, where it shows how many countries they've done that with. So anyway, this is what Mike Pompeo says, that he says they shouldn't wait until he gets elected. They should start acting now to, the US government, and the US government should start acting now to prevent Jeremy Corbyn from becoming elected. And that's something I'm sure they're doing right now anyway. I know that he says they should start, but I'm sure they've been doing it in any way they can, because that's what they do. They constantly meddle in other governments, other countries' democracies, and yet here is the UK government, and the UK government spokesperson hasn't said anything about those comments from Mike Pompeo. What a surprise. And yet the UK government under Theresa May and probably Boris Johnson go on and on about Russia, the whole Russiagate thing. Russia's meddling in this, Russia's meddling in that. And then the minute the US actually says it, actually says something like that, it's, crickets. So that's really unfortunate because, between the mainstream media and their constant smearing of Jeremy Corbyn being anti-Semitic and whatever, which is completely false, and then the US government meddling, it's going to be a real uphill battle. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was Senator Rex Patrick from Australia. He's from the Centre Alliance Party, and you may recall I did a video about him and his speaking out on behalf of Julian Assange for the Australian government to protect Julian Assange. And then later on, of course, when there was the Australian Federal Police raids on the ABC and on Anika Smethurst, who is a News Corp journalist. She did journalism about surveillance, the overreaching of the Australian government in relation to surveilling Australian citizens, and the ABC in 2017, I think it was, they did the Afghan Files, which was exposing war crimes of the Australian Special Forces. Well, both the ABC and Anika Smethurst, they were raided by the Australian Federal Police recently, and a whole bunch of files were taken, and a real sort of fascist move on behalf of the Scott Morrison government and Peter Dutton, who's a thug, he's head of the Home Affairs, which is a nice little fascist department of the Australian government, a little bit like the Department of Homeland Security kind of thing. That's what the Home Affairs thing is. And so anyway, about Rex Patrick, it continued on his harassment when this one of the major head kickers of the Home Affairs Department, Mr. Palooza, is this his name, Palooza? He called Senator Patrick, and it's not unusual for Senator Patrick to get different calls from different departments because he's a crossbencher. And so anyway, Mr. Palooza called him, and it was sort of like a bit of a veiled threat, basically, that he didn't like the criticisms of the Home Affairs Department and himself and Peter Dutton, and that Senator Patrick should refrain from that in future, basically instructing him to shut up or else. He didn't sort of say or else, but that's what that meant. And he said he wasn't going to, he said it was slanderous what he said, which is basically, Senator Patrick was basically just criticizing, like all the rest of them, even the media were criticizing the raids on the by the Australian Federal Police on the ABC and Anika Smith House. And Senator Patrick was just being open about that. But I would hazard a guess that one of the reasons that Mr. Palooza from the Home Affairs Department decided to pick on Senator Patrick is because Senator Patrick is probably the only senator who has been outspoken about the protection of Julian Assange in relation to press freedoms, and that we should we should intervene to prevent the extradition of Julian Assange to a definite future in prison in solitary confinement for 175 years under the Espionage Act, just for the crime, in quotes, of being a journalist. So that's Senator Patrick is the only one that seems to have any sort of backbone. No offense to invertebrates. The only person that seems to have a backbone in relation to Julian Assange. He's the only senator really that has said that. So it's interesting. I find that interesting, and I don't think other people have caught on to this. But I find it interesting that they have chosen Senator Patrick, of all the different people that had a problem with these Australian Federal Police raids on journalists. And I find it interesting they chose him to ring up and kind of give this sort of menacing phone call. So that's something to keep an eye on. And I would, if you are Australian or if you're not, doesn't matter. Please support Senator Patrick on his Twitter page and on his Facebook page. I will leave in the information section a link to the explanation Senator Patrick has given to this phone call, and he's going to be reporting this phone call to the Senate and to the Home Affairs Office because it's inappropriate. And but he's written a few paragraphs on his Facebook page, Senator Rex Patrick, so I will leave a link to that, and or maybe I'll copy and paste it into the information section of this video. So it's great to see at least one senator out of all those senators that has some sort of moral standing on the issue of press freedom, and also on the persecution of Julian Assange, which is many countries persecuting him: the UK, the US, Australia, Sweden. And basically, at the present time, Julian Assange is in Belmarsh Prison, which is a high maximum security prison. It's really, really very tough there. And he's very ill. We haven't heard anything about if he's recovering at all or if he's going downhill. That's really unfortunate that there doesn't seem to be any report about this since he's been put in the hospital wing of the Belmarsh Prison. And who knows what kind of hospital wing that is, how basic it might be. So we don't know how ill Julian Assange is. Last reports, he was barely able to converse with his lawyers. So that's how badly his health has gone downhill, that he's having cognitive problems and speech problems, and that he's lost a tremendous amount of weight, which could indicate that he has cancer, something like that. But anyway, it's unfortunate. This is the sort of budding fascism we have here in Australia, which I knew would happen. I knew it would happen when Scott Morrison got back in a few weeks ago in the Australian federal election. I knew he would see that as some sort of mandate to push his right-wing agenda and to become more like the United States, the sort of the fascist-leaning the fascist-leaning administration they have there. And I'm not just blaming the Trump administration. All of those administrations have been having a war on whistleblowers and have been, they've all persecuted Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. And yet nobody seems to be putting together. I'm sure they know it's very clear, but none of the mainstream media has put together the Australian Federal Police raids and Julian Assange. Both of these things are the same. Julian Assange is a publisher, he's a journalist, and he received information from Chelsea Manning, a whistleblower, about war crimes. And in the case of the ABC received information from a whistleblower, I think it's David McBride, about the Afghan files, war crimes in Afghanistan. I mean, I don't really see any difference, do you? The only difference with WikiLeaks and Julian Assange is that WikiLeaks does it on a much grander scale. They get a lot better, they get a lot more whistleblowers coming to them because they have such security, encryptions, etc., and they're able to protect whistleblowers, even though Chelsea Manning, they found out who Chelsea Manning is, but that wasn't difficult, and it wasn't due to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks protects its sources, but there's no difference between what any journalist does any day of the week and what Julian Assange has done with Chelsea Manning and other whistleblowers on WikiLeaks. And yet the mainstream media is conveniently just pretending that's not related, and just as usual, just ignoring Julian Assange in relation to this issue. And it's all related, and this is all part of the budding fascism that's happening in Australia right now, in real time, before our eyes. I'm glad to see that these sort of things are being noticed. I'm glad that Rex Patrick was trending on Twitter, and that was an important thing, and that these issues are being noticed and presented by the mainstream media. That gives me some hope that they're not completely stupid, and that they actually are aware that their own careers and their own lives are being threatened by these sorts of fascist moves by the Australian government. But it's just amazing to me how they ignore Julian Assange. And one thing and this includes the Australian senators, all of them except Rex Patrick. And the other thing that I noticed today, speaking of fascism, on Twitter today, and let's never ever think that Twitter isn't a arm of the national security state, because when it comes to Israel, you always see the IDF tweets always first. You always see the blue ticks that keep the narrow range of debate. You never really, it has a way of, its algorithms have a way of filtering out any real dissent that goes outside of the usual acceptable narrative or the government narrative. And I saw it today as a hashtag. What was it? Deporta, I think it is. It was in Spanish or Portuguese. I'm sorry. It was Deporta Greenwald. So basically, it was a hashtag to deport Greenwald, Glenn Greenwald, out of the country. He's an independent journalist, and I just thought how interesting that this hashtag. They managed to get a hashtag up, and I notice on Twitter that these hashtags just suddenly appear, and I don't believe it's because suddenly there's thousands and thousands of people tweeting something. They actually have maybe a few people tweeting it, and then Twitter just takes that up because it's in the best interest of the government, or they're part of the national security state. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. They're all arms of the national security state. So this is what came up today. And you know that in Brazil, Bolsonaro is literally a fascist leader, and he's losing popularity, but still, people like Glenn Greenwald lives in Brazil, and he addresses the national security state of the United States, and he criticizes Bolsonaro. So what a surprise to see a hashtag, deport Greenwald on Twitter. So never ever think that Twitter is something outside of the arms of the national security state. It absolutely is part of it. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please click the like button if you like the content. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and click the notifications bell so you receive updates. And thank you so much for watching. Leave comments if you wish. I always appreciate your comments. Thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vigo. Till next time. Bye.